again, we're glad that we're out here with Dawn and being able to talk a little bit about the pasture. But back to what are the soil health principles that we want to be trying to manage for. First was context, and I appreciate what you said, Dawn, earlier this morning. Context is always first. And I just love the fact that that was brought up because, you know, wherever we go, you know, a lot of times I'll be consulting somewhere. Without that context, it really doesn't matter what the recommendations are, because practices can always look different even though that we're trying to manage for the same principles. So out here, what's the context that we already heard from Dawn earlier today? How long has this been in pasture? How long ago did they start trying to put it in? 07. So that they started with alfalfa. Nice thing about alfalfa is what? It is a legume, yeah. So it's putting some nitrogen back into the soil in addition to encourage some of the grasses. Now, did you put any grasses at all?
No.
So no grasses at all, and just over time, that trashy alfalfa field became what? High quality forage. And what's the nice thing about grass in complement with alfalfa? Yeah, you've got a balance between the carbohydrates within the grass versus the nitrogen within the alfalfa. Some of the best hays for cattle I've ever seen is a mixture of about 30% alfalfa and about 70% grass. And so those are what we're trying to manage for. And then having this complement out here, what do we see? What are the forages that you see out here?
Alfalfa, fescue.
Yes. Okay. A little bit of Canadian thistle. Yep. Dandelions. And there's several species of grasses out here. Now, I may be a range specialist, but I also grew up in the South. So I can tell you those from the South a whole lot better than I can up here in the North. But the reality of it is I tell people, you know, plant ID is wonderful. It's really knowing what category are they in. Are they annuals, perennials? Are they cool season or warm season? Are they grasses, forbs, legumes? Our country, a lot of browse. Y'all got a lot of browse up here. Just knowing where they fit within that structure and what do we want to manage for, and then long term, what was this like? What was the NRCS range, if it has a range site classification, what would be here naturally? Prairie grasses, big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass. You have a lot of stuff that we have down in Texas that we're trying to, in Oklahoma, that we're trying to manage for as well. And I can tell you, I've seen more big blue stem up here, just my drive from Minneapolis over here, than I've seen in Oklahoma in a long time. You got to get to the right places to find it. So we've got the desirable grasses here that are beginning to manifest themselves. It continues to get better. What else do we see? Cover. We've got lots of cover. If you look down, kind of look around you, can you see the ground? Not very easy. Look down there and part it. Do we see much litter below the surface? There's a little bit of litter cover. It's not a lot, but when you look at how much legumes out here, I'm not surprised. When we have a lot of nitrogen with the legumes, the organisms in the soil actually take up that carbon that's going to be litter on the surface. It's going to be difficult to have much of a thatch on top. But that's okay. You know, right now it's turning over rapidly, and when they come back in here for another grazing event, what's going to happen? Going to have the trample effect. And with that trample effect, what are we feeding? Microbes and the other soil organisms. Yeah, you look at the earthworms, for example. What do they eat? Carbon at the surface. Now, if it just stays standing up like this all the time, how much of that gets down there to where an organism can work on it? Not very much. So what we want it to do is, if we can't make use of it through the livestock, and we don't want to make use of all of it because there's a lot more organisms in the soil that we're trying to feed than the animals above, which is a concept a lot of producers need to understand, that we need to feed the organisms. How do we get that food on the soil surface so it can begin to feed the macroorganisms and the microorganisms? That's our job. Management has one key term in that: who controls the management? Man, we do. There's a lot of things we can't control. There's a lot of factors. Can't control our environment, can't necessarily control climate very well, and we know we can't control the prices. Now, we do some things to help ourselves, but when it comes time to controlling how we manage the land, that's all on us. So we got good cover. What about disturbance? Have we seen any disturbance?
Not really.
Not really. What's going to be the worst disturbance that's going to happen out here? I'm sorry? Overgrazing? Not necessarily overgrazing, but grazing.
When they come trampling.
Yeah, when they come in. Okay, trampling. It's all this is a disturbance. Now, what's one of the key things that we say about disturbance? We want to minimize disturbance, therefore short time.
So one piece
Yes.
of the context on that this year that we're seeing, because of all of the insects that we're dealing with, we had flies early, we've got mosquitoes, bugs, but the flies especially have been bad with all of our livestock, no matter where it's at. And so we're getting way more trample than we are consumption. And so we're having to increase our sizes of paddocks because of that. It's kind of frustrating because we got all that feed out there, but then we have to remember that we're feeding the soil also. So
And that's just because they're moving so much?
they're moving, they're just not happy. I mean, you can see that. They typically wouldn't be doing that, but they're just grouping up and they're miserable. We've tried to we can't move away from the bugs far enough in order to get them out of them. We've been told in the past, you can move X amount of space and you should be fine. Not this year.
Every year is going to be a little bit different, but I think that's a really neat observation. If you go back, how many of y'all read Holistic Resource Management by Alan Savory? I like you already. When I started graduate school, that's what my professor, he came to me as an undergraduate and says, Hugh, I'd like for you to be be a part of my graduate program. He said, but I've got one requirement before you start. And he handed me the book, the first edition, which is not near as good as the most recent editions. Read this Holistic Resource Management. He says, the fact is, there's a lot of truisms in what Alan Savory says. Science may never prove it. He said, but that's okay. Come with an open mind. Look at those principles. And back almost 40 years ago, it was 40 years ago. That was what I did. I read through it and he says, that makes a whole lot of sense. We start talking about the bison. And it wasn't just bison in those big herds, especially in the spring when everybody's having the little fawns and the lamb, I call them lambs, but all the babies that are being born. What's the best way to protect your little ones? Yeah, in a group. Be a bit part of a big group, and then by natural selection, it's a lot less likely your offspring's going to get caught. So you had the bison, you had several different types of deer, probably had antelope, some places you had moose. You had all these animals working together during that early spring, I say early spring, but spring and early summer, and you had this milling effect. And then you get the flies, what happens? Yeah, you get this milling effect. They keep milling, and that's one thing that Savory says is when you go and you look at it, the herd effect is when you have animals so densely together that it changes their behavior. And that's what I really love is the animal behavior. It's getting out and actually looking, seeing what the animals are doing. And we'll get a chance to do that tomorrow. Once they come in here, we'll see what they chose, what they selected, but make a visual picture now of what you see, and then we're gonna see what it looks like after they've grazed for about 24 hours.
I have a question.
Yes, sir, David.
Has this pasture been grazed yet this summer? Or?
Like I said, we tiptoed across it very early and then got them out of here.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was this one. I wasn't.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what they're seeing. So the animals right now, because of the impact of the flies and the mosquitoes and everything else, you're getting more of a herd effect, the true effect that bison would have had. So we're seeing that you're going to get more lay it down, but there's no such thing as wasted forage. If it's laid down, it's feeding something. The only time that I'd say that it's almost to that point is when it's left standing up. But in some environments, as you go further west in the western parts of the United States, it's more important to have something. And you can't always lay it down, because if you lay it down, it may be lost. So there's a fine line. So it's back to knowing your context. Yes, sir, Jason.
You know, we were talking about the introduction of nitrogen by legumes. What about cattle's urine? Does that break down a lot of the thatch and the trampled residue?
It contributes. But really, you're going to get more total nitrogen across the entire space with the legume than you will with the urine. Urine usually happens in those little patches. And you can go out there later in the year, at least in our places where we have very low fertility, and you'll see those little yellow spots where the urine, or sometimes it'll be the manure from the early spring, that you'll see those little spots out there where everything grows up and the cattle don't want to eat it. But for the most part, when you've got really good diversity with the legume mixture like they have here, you're not going to see it near as much. But it does contribute, yes. Okay, what about the other soil health principles? Diversity. Lots of it. And growing. You see you got 40-something plants out here now. So it continues to expand. That's where knowing having a little bit of plant ID helps. But is it essential? No. You know, I tell most of the people that I work with, you know, what does a cow typically like to eat? Describe a leaf that they'll want to eat. Soft, pliable, wide, long. If you got grasses that are kind of making that description, guess what? They're probably going to eat it. Yeah, big blue stem got a wide leaf. Do y'all have any eastern gamma grass up in this part of the country? Mark, do y'all have eastern gamma grass up here? I don't know. Okay. That's the ice cream plants of ice cream plants. You know, they take it over big blue stem. It looks like a Johnson grass plant if you're familiar with Johnson grass. Big old broad leaf about like this. You know, it'll make leaves that come up about this tall if you pull them up, but they make a lot of tonnage. And you'll see some pictures on the slides later today. But you get that type of grass. What do they go for? What do the animals go for? Those desired plants first. And then they'll come back here and eat some of the others. I love the video that you had in there where it showed them eating those big wide plants of the sorghum Sudan. And then what are they doing? You're doing also. They're going down there getting some really quality stuff down there at the bottom. So they're gonna eat the alfalfa, they're gonna eat these broad plants that are out here. But take a look at some of these plants that are here, and then let's make a note what's here when they come back tomorrow. Which ones did they take the most? Okay, so diversity. Other thing, we wanna have a living root year round. I can already tell that you've got cool season grasses out here, you got warm season grasses. If you got perennials, the roots are always alive. Now they may not be doing a whole heck of a lot, but at least they're always alive. So we wanna make sure we have the diversity in perennials and annuals, cool season and warm season. So there's always something active so that the organisms in the soil have it. So what else do we have to have? Cover. We got the cover, yes. And we know we got good cover here. And then we gotta have livestock. So with the livestock, that's the easy part because that's what their passion is. You know, I heard it this morning, you know, when Grant was talking, you know, they wanted to run more cattle. That was the first goal. Was that the right goal to start with? It was a motivating goal.
Dawn didn't work in town anymore. So
yeah, there you go.
We had to have more cattle.
Got to justify it. And we find a lot of folks that do that. But sometimes what we have to do is we got to take a step back to run more. In our part of the country, people like to overgraze, you know, and I'll talk more about it. But everybody wants to they want to manage their stocking rate for what? Average year. Now, how many times have you seen an average year in your lifetime, David?
About 1 every 10.
Yeah, there you go. About 1 out of 10. Sometime less than that. And even that, what do you call average? Plus or minus a ½ inch or plus or minus an inch? And then what does it look like across the year? You know, when moisture occurs makes a big difference as well. How do you adjust your management to that? So that's what I like to really focus on is what's our plan under what conditions we're trying to manage for, and average may not be where we need to be. So what are we doing in our contingencies to make sure that we're never stocking greater than carrying capacity? And in our part of the country, nobody thinks about that until the day after it's too late. The prices have cratered, everybody wants to sell, everybody's already selling, the market goes down, and then I can't afford to sell those, so what do? They cannibalize all the improvements they had on the land because they didn't have a contingency plan to start with. As I look at an hierarchy, and I'll talk more about it later, an hierarchy of decisions on my grazing management, it all begins with making sure my stocking rate stays below carrying capacity. And if I'm going to carry a little bit longer, what's my contingency plan? We may have a sacrifice area. That's okay. We're trying to maintain the integrity of the bulk of what we're able to do, but you want to have a long-term plan based on different scenarios. We've been in a 3-year drought. I have not had to feed any hay at all for 3 years, but guess what I did have to do? I had to reduce stocking rate. We run about 500 cows, brother cows right now. We were up at 700. That's what we have to do in order to make sure that we're going not only to spring, but 30 days into spring. Why do I want to go 30 days into spring? What's that first grass like in the spring? Is it balanced between carbon and nitrogen, between TDN and crude protein? It's not. It's very highly weighted toward our crude protein. And when that happens, what happens to the manure? It's like water. You know, I used to palpate a lot of cows. And in the spring, in that high quality forage, you made darn sure you were standing just right. And when your arm went in, you held it just right. There's a lot of little...
You didn't wear that shirt.
And you didn't wear white. That's exactly, it was dark blue. So see, this is what you have to think about when we start managing for the animals. I want 30 days in there because I want some residual forage from last year. Now it's a little harder up here because most of years if you get snow, it's going to lay it down. So you've got a little different environment. But if I can manage for it, I want a little bit of high carbohydrate forage to mix in with that really high new growth that's coming, high crude protein that's coming in with the new growth. So we do that, that's why 30 days. It takes 30 days for that crude protein and TDN to balance to where I will have about a 4-to-1 ratio. That's what I'm looking for. And if I do that, I don't ever get the squirts. What they do, it may be a 2, but it moves to 3 really fast if I'm managing my grazing. So I'm watching not only the grass, the condition of the grass, but I'm also looking at what's coming out the animal and looking at their gut feel, looking at their animal behavior. We made the change at Noble 3 years ago to be completely regenerative. We had guys that spent their whole summer fertilizing, weed spraying, making hay, fertilizing, making hay, spraying for army worms, grasshoppers, making hay. So I told them, I said, what we're going to do is I want you to take your time. I want you watching the cattle. I want to know when they start grazing in the morning and when they quit that first grazing period. How many, if they got all things being that they're not, there's adequate quantity and quality, how many hours a day will a cow graze? 8. How many hours do they loaf? 8. How many hours do they actually rest and ruminate? 8, ideally. If you got high quality, they're going to graze a little bit more because it's moving through them faster. So when we get to later in the year, we want to make sure they're about 8 hours. Now, when's their primary grazing periods? They graze all day? Morning and evening. There's two major grazing periods, one in the morning, one in the evening. They may have a little bit in an early afternoon, maybe late morning, but it's not a major. And then if you get a full moon, guess what? They may graze during the night. In my research project, what we had was these little counters that were on their heads, and we could see when they were grazing throughout the day. And when we noted there would be periods when they would be grazing quite a bit, we went back out there and it was because they had a full moon or close to a full moon. So they were grazing a whole lot more during those periods of time. But it still came out about 8 until we put them under a lot of stress. And then it begins to shift. And what really picks up is the amount of time that they spend grazing versus resting, because if they're carrying in taking a lot of roughage, their rumination time still has to be there. So they give up on the rest. So all this is part of the behavior that I love to get into when I get out there and start watching cattle. So I wanted these guys out there on the ranches, is I tell them, I says, what I want you to do is watch the cattle. That's your job. So we came time, we started moving them basically every day. And they noticed the first thing that they realized that the animals were more content than they've ever been. Now, who would have thought that? If you give them the whole pasture and let them graze for a week, you'd thought that they'd have been more comfortable. They actually were more content when they were in a herd and you moved them on a daily basis, because every time you moved them, they always got something really good. And there was a contentment that we observed in the animals. The other thing that they noticed is that they became a lot more gentle. When it came time to sorting off the bulls, we went to the fence. We had two pastures, one on the left, one on the right. As they kind of walked them through there, they just walked one side or the other. The bulls went one way, the cows went the other, and it worked out really well. We can do that with the calves most of the time too. All these are just little things, but the only way you can do that is if you spend time with the cattle. Back to behavior. So grazing management is really important to me. How do we graze? What are we going to graze? And then what's the long-term outcome? Now, we're in a pretty wet situation up here, even though it's in mid-July. I'm not down in Oklahoma. You know, we are really, really dry. So we've adjusted our grazing. So when it's really fast, do you rotate your cattle faster or slower? Faster. And when it becomes drier, we slow it down. We want to match our grazing rate of rotation based on the growth rate of our desired forages. And we're keying off the grass out there that requires the most rest and recovery. Because these lower successional plants, they may recover really rapidly. But I'm going to, back to a point that y'all said this morning, we're going to manage for what we want, not what we don't. So that's what we got to do. So right now, what I'd like for you to do is we've got to determine how much forage is out here. Y'all got any visual estimates? Do y'all want to shoot me? That's why we got the little sticks. What we want to do, have y'all ever done this little exercise where you lay this thing down at the soil surface, just like this. Lay it right down there underneath the bottom. Had it kind of weave it through whatever plants are there. Set it up right where you can see the numbers, and then look down, right above it. And what we're looking for, how many of the numbers on this yardstick can you see?
8.
You said 8.
8. About a few more.
10. 9. What'd you hear over here? 14. 13. I've got a really good spot. I see about 10. So, pull your stick up. Look over there on one of the sides. If I can find it right there. It's not on this one, is it? Okay.
This one doesn't read very well.
Well, what it is that what we're looking for is if you've got, as a rule of thumb, if you can see less than 3 of those numbers, you are at about 90, or if you can see, word this right, if you can see 10% or less of those numbers, so about 3 to 4, you're at about 300 pounds per inch of height to forage. If you get somewhere in there where you can only see, what does it say? 80% of those numbers, it's about 200 pounds per acre inch. And then if it's at 70% that you can see, it's about